the dusty equipment barn of Garrett Ranch in Rolling Hills, Kansas, ranch owner Frank Garrett made what he thought was the cruelest joke of his life, daring 6-year-old Annie Grace Walker to fix the massive hay baler that had stumped 3 experienced mechanics for 2 weeks, threatening to destroy the entire harvest and bankrupt the operation. What happened next defied every assumption about age, capability, and respect as the little girl methodically diagnosed a complex hydraulic failure, revealed engineering knowledge that shouldn't exist in someone so young, and uncovered a military cover-up involving her deceased mother's classified agricultural research that had been buried for years, transforming not just a broken machine, but an entire community's understanding of who deserves to be heard. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the wheat fields surrounding Rolling Hills, Kansas, painting the golden stalks in shades of amber and rust. Annie Grace Walker pressed her small nose against the passenger window of her father's weathered Ford pickup, watching the endless waves of grain dance in the early August breeze. At 6 years old, she possessed an unusual stillness for a child, her dark eyes taking in every detail of the landscape with the careful attention of someone much older. "Daddy, why do the wheat heads look so heavy today?" she asked, her voice carrying the soft drawl that marked her as a native of the Kansas plains. Cole Walker glanced at his daughter through the rearview mirror, noting how she studied everything, with that intense focus that reminded him so much of her mother. "Harvest time's coming, sweetheart. Those heads are full of grain, ready to be cut and gathered." He paused, his weathered hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. "That's why we gotta get that baler fixed today. Mr. Garrett's counting on us." Annie nodded solemnly, understanding more about the economics of farming than most children her age. Living next to one of the largest ranches in the county had taught her that broken equipment meant lost crops, and lost crops meant families going hungry. She'd heard the worried conversations between her father and the other ranch hands, seen the lines of stress etched deeper into faces as the harvest season approached. The truck rumbled down the gravel road that separated the Walker family's modest farm from the sprawling Garrett Ranch. 2,000 acres of prime Kansas farmland stretched in every direction, dotted with cattle and marked by the occasional windmill spinning lazily in the morning air. Cole had worked for Frank Garrett for 8 years, ever since he'd returned from his second deployment overseas with the Army Corps of Engineers. The job had been a lifeline then, a way to support his pregnant wife and build a stable life after the chaos of military service. "Remember what I told you about staying close today," Cole said as they approached the ranch's main gate. "The barn's gonna be busy with folks trying to figure out what's wrong with that baler. You just find a quiet spot and work on that puzzle book Granny May gave you." Annie fingered the small backpack in her lap, filled with coloring books, puzzles, and the mechanical pencils she preferred over crayons. Hidden beneath the children's activities was something else entirely, a worn notebook where she'd been sketching machine parts and jotting down observations about how things worked. She learned early not to let the adults see it. They always asked too many questions she couldn't answer, or worse, they'd laugh and tell her father his little girl had quite an imagination. The ranch headquarters came into view as they crested a small hill, a cluster of buildings arranged around a large farmyard. The main house sat back from the road, a 2-story white structure with green shutters and a wraparound porch that spoke of prosperity built over generations. Closer to the road stood the equipment barn, a massive metal building that housed millions of dollars worth of farming machinery. Even from a distance, Annie could see the unusual amount of activity around the barn's open doors. Cole parked near the other vehicles scattered around the farmyard and killed the engine. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant lowing of cattle, and the rhythmic clank of a windmill. "You stay in the truck while I check in with Isabella," he said, referring to the ranch foreman who'd become something of a surrogate aunt to Annie over the years. "She'll know where you can set up for the day." As her father walked toward the barn, Annie watched through the windshield as several men emerged from the building, their body language tense with frustration. She recognized most of them. Tyler, Murphy, whom everyone called Ace because of his skill with complicated repairs, Clint Morrison, the oldest hand on the ranch who'd been working cattle since before Annie was born, and standing slightly apart from the others, Frank Garrett himself. Even from a distance, Annie could see the ranch owner's agitation in the way he gestured sharply with his hands and the rigid set of his shoulders. Frank Garrett was a man accustomed to solving problems with money and authority, but the massive hay baler sitting silent in the barn represented a challenge that neither could touch. At 48, he'd inherited the ranch from his father and had spent the last 15 years expanding operations and modernizing equipment. The baler represented a $250,000 investment that should have been cutting and bundling hay with mechanical precision, not sitting dead while precious harvest days slipped away. Annie climbed out of the truck and shouldered her backpack, drawn by the voices carrying across the farmyard. Her father was deep in conversation with Isabella Fernandez, the ranch foreman whose calm competence had earned the respect of every person who worked the land. Isabella had been the first to welcome Cole when he'd started at the ranch, recognizing in him the same dedication and attention to detail that had made her indispensable to 3 generations of Garretts. "Morning, mija," Isabella said, as Annie approached, her voice carrying the warm accent that reflected her family's 3-generation presence in Kansas. "Your papa says you might want to spend some time in the shade today while the men work on the big machine." Annie looked toward the barn, where she could see the massive yellow and green bulk of the hay baler through the open doors. "What's wrong with it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Isabella knelt down to Annie's level, her weathered face kind but serious. "Nobody knows for certain. The hydraulics aren't working right, and when that happens, the whole machine stops functioning. We've had 3 different mechanics look at it, and nobody can figure out what's causing the problem." "How long has it been broken?" Annie asked. 2 weeks now," Isabella replied. 2 weeks when we should have been cutting and baling the hay in the north pastures. Every day we wait, more of the crop gets too mature or gets damaged by weather." Annie nodded, processing this information with the same methodical approach. She applied to everything. She understood the urgency even if she couldn't fully grasp the financial implications. Hay was what fed the cattle through the winter, and without adequate stores, the ranch would have to purchase feed at prices that could devastate the year's profits. A loud voice from the direction of the barn cut through the morning air, sharp, with frustration and barely controlled anger. "I don't want to hear any more excuses," Frank Garrett was saying to a group of men clustered around the baler. "I've got contractors coming next week to start the soybean harvest, and if this machine isn't running by then, we're looking at a total loss on the hay crop." Annie found herself walking toward the barn, drawn by curiosity and the glimpse of the complex machinery visible through the doors. The hay baler dominated the space, its yellow metal skin gleaming under the fluorescent lights. It was a marvel of agricultural engineering designed to cut hay, compress it into dense rectangular bales, and tie them with twine in one continuous operation. When functioning properly, it could process acres of hay in a single day. When broken, it was nothing more than an expensive monument to frustration. Cole noticed his daughter approaching and moved to intercept her. "Annie, I thought I told you to stay back by the truck." "I wanted to see the machine," she said simply, her eyes already studying the visible parts of the baler with an intensity that made several of the men pause in their conversation. Frank Garrett turned at the sound of voices, his gaze falling on the small girl with dark hair pulled back in two neat braids. His face, already flushed with heat and aggravation, darkened further. "Cole, I thought we agreed that today was going to be all hands focused on getting this thing running. I can't have distractions." "She's not a distraction, Mr. Garrett," Cole replied, his voice measured but firm. "She'll stay out of the way." "Kids don't belong around heavy machinery," Frank continued, his voice carrying across the barn. "This isn't a playground." Annie looked up at the ranch owner, taking in his expensive boots, pressed jeans, and the silver belt buckle that proclaimed his membership in the Kansas Cattlemen's Association. She'd been around adults long enough to recognize the type of authority that came from ownership rather than knowledge, and something in his dismissive tone sparked a reaction she couldn't quite name. "I know it's not a playground," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the attention of several grown men now focused on her. "I know it's a John Deere 568 round baler with PowerTech hydraulics, and I know it's been sitting broken for 2 weeks while the hay gets too mature to process properly." The silence that followed was complete, broken only by the distant sound of cattle and the whisper of wind through the barn's open doors. Tyler Murphy, who'd been wiping his hands on an oil-stained rag, stopped mid-motion and stared. Clint Morrison raised his eyebrows, and even Isabella, who'd followed Annie into the barn, looked surprised. Frank Garrett's expression shifted from annoyance to something closer to confusion. "What did you just say?" Annie adjusted her backpack and took a step closer to the machine, her small hands clasped behind her back in a gesture that made her look even younger than her 6 years. "It's a 568 round baler. The model number's right there on the side, and if the hydraulics aren't working, it's probably because there's a pressure loss somewhere in the system or a problem with the control valve." Tyler Murphy let out a short laugh, but it wasn't mocking. "Well, I'll be damned. How'd you know all that?" "I read," Annie said simply. "And I watch things." Frank Garrett looked at Cole with an expression that mixed disbelief with something approaching irritation. "You been teaching your kid about farm equipment?" Cole shook his head slowly, his own surprise evident. "She picks things up on her own. Always has. Picks things up," Frank repeated, his tone skeptical. "Right." He looked back at Annie, studying her with the same attention he might give to a piece of equipment he was considering purchasing. "So you think you know what's wrong with a $250,000 machine that 3 certified mechanics couldn't fix?" Annie met his gaze without flinching, though her voice remained soft. "I didn't say I knew what was wrong. I said if the hydraulics aren't working, there are usually specific reasons why that happens." Clint Morrison stepped forward, his weathered, a face showing the first hint of genuine interest. "What kind of reasons? Fluid contamination, seal failure, pump problems, or control valve issues?" Annie replied without hesitation. "Or sometimes it's something simple like a clogged filter or a loose connection that everybody misses because they're looking for something complicated." Frank Garrett's jaw tightened, and Annie could see something shift in his expression. The look of a man who'd been challenged by someone he considered beneath his notice. "Is that so?" he said, his voice taking on an edge that made Cole tense. "Well, since you seem to know so much about it, maybe you'd like to take a look and show us what we've been missing." The words hung in the air like a dare, and Annie could feel the attention of every person in the barn focused on her. She understood instinctively that this was a test, though she wasn't sure what she was being tested for. Behind Frank Garrett's challenge, she sensed something harder than mere skepticism, a dismissal so complete that he was willing to humiliate a child to make his point. Cole started to step forward. "Mr. Garrett, she's just a little girl." "No," Annie said quietly, cutting him off. "It's okay, Daddy." She looked up at Frank Garrett, her dark eyes serious. "If you want me to look at it, I'll look at it." Frank's smile was sharp and humorless. "Outstanding." Let's see what the expert thinks. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Annie walked toward the massive hay baler with the careful steps of someone approaching a sleeping giant. The machine towered above her small frame, its yellow metal housing scarred by years of field work and Kansas weather. Up close, she could see the intricate network of hydraulic lines snaking across the frame like mechanical arteries, each one serving a specific function in the complex dance of cutting, compressing, and binding hay into uniform bales. The other, men in the barn, moved aside to give her space, their expressions ranging from curious to skeptical. Tyler Murphy crossed his arms and leaned against a workbench, while Clint Morrison removed his worn baseball cap and scratched his graying head. Isabella remained near the barn entrance, her face unreadable but her posture alert, like someone watching a chess match where the stakes were higher than anyone wanted to admit. Frank Garrett positioned himself where he could observe both Annie and the reactions of his employees, his arms folded across his chest in a gesture that radiated authority and barely concealed amusement. He'd made this challenge expecting either immediate failure or tearful retreat, either of which would serve his purpose of putting both the child and her father in their proper place. What he hadn't expected was the methodical way Annie began her examination, starting not with the obvious hydraulic components, but with a visual inspection of the entire machine. "First thing you do is look for what doesn't belong," Annie said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the barn's acoustics. She walked slowly around the perimeter of the baler, her hands clasped behind her back, her eyes scanning every visible surface. Sometimes the problem isn't where you think it is. She paused near the rear of the machine, crouching down to examine a hydraulic line that disappeared beneath the main housing. Her small fingers traced the air, just above the metal surface, following the path of the line without actually touching it. "This coupling here looks newer than the others," she observed. Tyler pushed himself away from the workbench and moved closer. "Yeah, we replaced that last month. Seal was leaking." Annie nodded thoughtfully. "What kind of seal?" "Standard O-ring." "Same as always," Tyler replied, then paused. "Why?" Instead of answering directly, Annie continued her circuit of the machine. She stopped near the control panel, a complex array of switches, gauges, and indicator lights that would challenge many adults. The panel showed several warning lights, their red glow indicating various system failures that had stumped the previous mechanics. "Can someone turn on the hydraulic pump?" she asked. Frank Garrett let out a short laugh. "You want us to start up a broken machine so you can listen to it not work?" "I want to hear what it sounds like when it tries to work," Annie corrected gently. "Machines talk if you know how to listen." Cole stepped forward, his hand moving toward the control panel before stopping and looking at Frank. "Your call, boss," Frank waved dismissively. "Go ahead, let her hear it fail." The hydraulic pump came to life with a low whine that gradually built to a steady hum. Annie closed her eyes, her head tilted slightly as she listened to the sounds emanating from different parts of the machine. To the men watching, it looked like a child playing at being a mechanic. To Annie, the sounds told a story of pressure, flow, and mechanical stress that was as clear as spoken words. "Turn it off," she said after 30 seconds. The silence that followed the pump's shutdown seemed heavier than before. Annie opened her eyes and looked up at the assembled adults, her expression serious. "The pump's working fine," she announced. "The pressure's building normally, and there's no cavitation noise that would indicate air in the system." Clint Morrison leaned forward. "Then what's the problem?" Annie walked to the side of the machine where a series of hydraulic cylinders controlled the bale compression mechanism. "The problem is that the pressure's building, but it's not getting where it needs to go. There's a blockage or restriction somewhere between the pump and the cylinders. We checked all the lines," Tyler protested. Twice. Did you check the filter housing? Annie asked. Tyler blinked. The what? Annie pointed to a cylindrical component, mounted near the main hydraulic reservoir. The inline filter. It's designed to catch debris before it can damage the pump or cylinders. If it gets clogged, it restricts flow even though pressure might still build in the pump circuit. Frank Garrett's expression had shifted from amusement to something more complex. How would you know about inline filters? Because every hydraulic system has them, Annie replied matter-of-factly. They're usually the first thing you check when you have pressure but no flow. Isabella spoke for the first time since they'd entered the barn. The child has a point. When did we last service the filter? The question hung in the air as the men looked at each other. Tyler pulled a maintenance log from his back pocket and flipped through several pages. Says here it was due for replacement 3 weeks ago, but... He trailed off, his face reddening slightly. But we've been too busy trying to fix the bigger problems to worry about routine maintenance, Clint finished, his voice carrying a note of chagrin. Annie nodded without judgment. It happens. When something big breaks, people forget about the small things that might have caused it. Frank's jaw tightened. So you're saying this whole problem might be nothing more than a dirty filter? Maybe, Annie said carefully, but there's only one way to find out. The filter housing was located in a cramped space beneath the main hydraulic reservoir, accessible only by lying on the ground and reaching up into the maze of metal components. Tyler retrieved a toolbox and began assembling the wrenches needed to remove the filter housing, muttering under his breath about tight spaces and poor design. Let me, Annie said quietly. Tyler paused, wrench in hand. You want to crawl under there? I'm smaller, she pointed out logically. I can reach it easier than you can. Frank stepped forward, his voice sharp. Absolutely not. I'm not having a child working on my equipment. Insurance alone would... She's not working on it, Cole interrupted, speaking for the first time since the examination began. She's just looking. Tyler can do the actual work. Annie was already moving toward the space beneath the machine, her small size allowing her to navigate between hydraulic lines and support brackets that would challenge a full-grown man. She emerged a moment later with grease on her shirt and a thoughtful expression on her face. The housing is tight, but not from normal wear, she reported. It feels like something's put pressure on it from the inside. Tyler squeezed into the space with considerably more difficulty, his larger frame requiring him to contort awkwardly to reach the filter housing. The sound of metal against metal rang through the barn as he worked to loosen the mounting bolts. After several minutes of struggling, he backed out with the cylindrical filter housing in his hands. The silence that followed was profound. The filter element inside the housing was completely black, clogged with a thick, tar-like substance that had reduced the flow opening to virtually nothing. But more disturbing was the nature of the contamination itself. It wasn't the typical dirt and metal particles that would accumulate during normal operation. This was something else entirely. A deliberate contamination that spoke of sabotage rather than neglect. What in the hell is that? Clint breathed. Annie studied the filter without touching it, her young face grave. That's not normal wear debris. Someone put that in there. Frank Garrett stared at the filter housing as if it had personally betrayed him. Are you saying someone deliberately damaged my equipment? I'm saying that kind of contamination doesn't happen by accident, Annie replied carefully. Hydraulic fluid doesn't naturally turn into that consistency unless it's been mixed with something it shouldn't be mixed with. Tyler set the housing on a nearby workbench and leaned closer to examine the black substance coating the filter element. Looks almost like... He paused, his expression darkening. Like someone mixed sand and motor oil into the hydraulic fluid. Isabella moved to the workbench, her experienced eyes taking in the evidence. This explains why the other mechanics couldn't find the problem. They were looking for mechanical failures, not sabotage. The word hung in the barn air like smoke from a fire no one wanted to acknowledge. Sabotage implied intention, planning, and access. It suggested that someone with knowledge of the ranch's operations and equipment had deliberately crippled the "Hey Baylor" at the worst possible time. Frank's face had gone pale beneath his summer tan. Who would do something like this? And why? Someone who wanted to hurt the ranch, Clint said grimly. Someone who knew exactly when to strike for maximum damage. Annie looked around at the adults, sensing the shift in mood from mechanical problem-solving to something darker and more complex. Will it work now if we put in a new filter? Tyler shook his head. Not until we flush the entire hydraulic system. That contamination has been circulating through the whole setup. Every line, every cylinder, every valve is probably contaminated. How long will that take? Frank asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer wouldn't be good. If we work around the clock, 3 days, maybe 4, Tyler replied. We'll have to drain everything, flush it with solvent, replace all the filters and refill with new fluid. Then we'll need to test every function to make sure nothing was damaged. Frank looked around the barn as if searching for someone to blame. His earlier amusement completely evaporated. 3 days we don't have. The contractors are scheduled for Monday, and if we can't get the hay crop processed before then... He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in the barn understood the economics. A failed hay crop would mean purchasing winter feed at market prices that could devastate the ranch's finances. Worse, it would force Frank to lay off workers, including some who'd been with the operation for decades. Annie watched the adults grapple with the implications of what she'd discovered, feeling a weight settle on her small shoulders that had nothing to do with mechanical problems. She'd solved the immediate mystery of why the baler wasn't working, but in doing so, she'd uncovered something that might be even more threatening to the people she cared about. There might be a faster way, she said quietly. All eyes turned to her, and she felt the familiar flutter of nervousness that came when adults focused their full attention on her. But beneath the nervousness was something else, a certainty that came from understanding how systems worked and what was possible when you approached problems from unexpected directions. "What kind of faster way?" Frank asked, his voice carrying a note of desperate hope. Annie looked at the contaminated filter, then at the complex hydraulic system of the baler, her mind already working through possibilities that the adults hadn't considered. Instead of flushing the whole system, what if we bypassed the contaminated sections and created a temporary clean circuit for the essential functions? Tyler frowned. "You mean jury-rig it?" "I mean engineer a workaround," Annie corrected gently. "Use clean hydraulic lines to bypass the contaminated sections, install inline filters at key points, and isolate the damaged components until after the harvest." The silence that followed was different from the skeptical quiet that had greeted her earlier observations. This was the silence of people confronting a solution they hadn't imagined, proposed by someone they'd never expected to take seriously. Isabella was the first to speak. "That might actually work. If we could get the compression and cutting systems operational, even without full functionality, we could process the hay crop," Frank finished, his voice carrying the first note of optimism it had held all morning. "It wouldn't be pretty, but it would get the job done." Annie nodded. "You'd need about 50 feet of new hydraulic line, some quick disconnect fittings, and at least 2 inline filters, plus a small auxiliary pump to maintain pressure in the bypass circuit." Tyler stared at her with something approaching awe. "Where did you learn about bypass circuits?" Annie hesitated, sensing that her answer mattered more than the question itself. Around her, the adults waited with an intensity that suggested they were beginning to understand that their assumptions about her had been fundamentally wrong from the beginning. "My mama taught me," she said simply, the words carrying a weight that none of them could have anticipated. The mention of Annie's mother created a silence that felt different from all the others, heavier, charged with unspoken questions and half-remembered conversations. Cole's face had gone carefully neutral, the expression he wore when someone stepped too close to territory he wasn't ready to share. Isabella studied Annie with new curiosity, while Tyler and Clint exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to piece together connections they'd never considered before. Frank Garrett cleared his throat, breaking the moment. "Well, regardless of where she learned it, we need to focus on whether this bypass idea will actually work." He gestured toward the contaminated filter still sitting on the workbench. "How long would it take to set up this temporary system?" Annie looked up at her father, seeking permission for something she couldn't quite name. Cole's slight nod released her to continue, though she could see the tension in his shoulders that suggested this conversation was heading somewhere he'd hoped to avoid. "If you have the parts, maybe 6 hours," she said. "But you'd need someone who understands hydraulic pressure calculations to make sure the bypass circuit can handle the load without creating dangerous back pressure." Tyler pulled a bandana from his pocket and wiped his hands, buying time to process what he was hearing. "And you understand these calculations?" "Some of them," Annie admitted. "The basic principles anyway. Flow rate, pressure drop, system capacity. It's mostly just math once you understand how the fluids behave." Clint removed his cap again, running weathered fingers through his thinning hair. "Annie, honey, that's engineering-level knowledge. That's not something most adults understand, let alone a 6-year-old. Annie shrugged, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both modesty and certainty. "Mama used to say that age doesn't matter if you're asking the right questions and listening to the answers." Isabella stepped closer, her voice gentle but probing. "Your mama was Marie Walker, wasn't she? Marie Hoffman, before she married your daddy?" Cole's entire body went rigid at the mention of his wife's maiden name. "Isabella, it's okay, Daddy," Annie said quietly. "She's not trying to be mean." She looked up at Isabella with those dark eyes that seemed to hold more understanding than should fit in someone so young. "Yes, Mom. Mama was Marie Hoffman Walker." Isabella's expression had shifted to something approaching reverence. "Mija, I knew your mother. Not well, but I knew of her. She was very special. You knew Mama." Annie's voice carried a hunger that made the adults in the barn exchange uncomfortable glances. Cole rarely spoke about his deceased wife, and Annie's questions about her mother were usually met with gentle deflection or promises to talk about it when she was older. "I knew she was brilliant," Isabella continued, ignoring Cole's warning look. "She had degrees in agricultural engineering and systems design. Before she married your father, she worked for companies that designed irrigation systems and farming equipment." Annie absorbed this information with the same methodical attention she'd given to the hay baler, filing away details that clearly meant more to her than the adults realized. "Is that where she learned about hydraulics?" "Among other things," Isabella replied carefully. "Your mother was involved in some very advanced projects, experimental systems, government contracts. She was working on ways to make farming more efficient and sustainable." Frank had been listening to this exchange with growing impatience, but something in Isabella's tone caught his attention. "Government contracts? What kind of government contracts?" Isabella hesitated, glancing at Cole, who had gone pale beneath his summer tan, the kind that required security clearances. The kind that dealt with feeding large populations in challenging environments. The implications hung in the barn air, like dust motes in sunlight, visible but not quite tangible. Annie looked between the adults, sensing currents of meaning that flowed just beyond her comprehension. She understood that her mother had been more than just the loving woman she barely remembered, but the extent of that more was only beginning to come into focus. "Daddy," she said quietly, "is that why you don't like to talk about Mama's work?" Cole's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, a nervous gesture that Tyler and Clint had never seen from the steady, reliable mechanic they'd worked alongside for years. "Annie, some things are complicated. Some things happened before you were born that are difficult to explain. But Mama taught me about hydraulics," Annie persisted. "She taught me about systems and how things work together. I remember her drawing diagrams and showing me how pressure flows through circuits." "You were 3 years old when she died," Cole said, his voice strained. "You couldn't possibly remember technical conversations." Annie's expression grew stubborn, a look that reminded everyone present of her mother in ways that made Cole's chest tighten. "I remember the smell of her perfume and the sound of her voice when she explained how things worked. I remember sitting on her lap while she drew pictures of machines and told me stories about making things better." The silence that followed was broken by the distant sound of cattle and the rhythmic creak of the windmill outside. Tyler cleared his throat awkwardly, sensing that the conversation had moved into territory that belonged to family rather than co-workers. "Maybe we should focus on getting this baler fixed," he suggested. "If Annie's bypass idea can work, we need to get started on it right away." Frank nodded, seizing on the opportunity to return to practical matters. "Agreed. What do we need to make this happen?" Annie seemed to shake herself back to the present, though her eyes remained thoughtful. "First, we need to map out which parts of the hydraulic system are contaminated and which parts might still be clean. Then we can design the bypass to route around the damaged sections." She walked to the baler and began pointing out specific components, her small voice taking on a confidence that contrasted sharply with her size. "The main pump is probably fine since it's upstream from the filter. The reservoir might be contaminated, but we can use a separate clean reservoir for the bypass circuit. The cylinders are probably the worst affected, since they're at the end of the system where debris would accumulate." Tyler followed her reasoning with growing amazement. "So we bypass the contaminated reservoir and cylinders, use clean lines to feed the essential functions, and isolate everything else until we can do a proper flush." "Exactly," Annie confirmed. "It won't be as efficient as the original system, but it should give you enough functionality to process the hay crop." Clint scratched his jaw thoughtfully. "What about parts? We're going to need hydraulic line, fittings, maybe a small pump like she mentioned. Rolling Hills Feed and Supply should have most of what we need," Isabella said. "I can call ahead and have them pull everything together." Frank looked around the group, his expression mixing determination with something approaching desperation. "How much is this going to cost?" "A lot less than losing the hay crop," Tyler replied pragmatically. "Maybe 3,000 for parts, assuming we do the labor ourselves." 3,000 we weren't planning to spend, Frank muttered, but his tone suggested he was already committed to the expense. "Fine, get what you need, but I want this thing running by tomorrow evening at the latest." Annie tilted her head thoughtfully. "Mr. Garrett, there's something else we should consider." "What's that?" "Whoever contaminated your hydraulic system probably knows about farm equipment. They knew exactly what would cause maximum damage with minimum immediate detection. That suggests they either work here or have worked on similar equipment before." The IDA implication settled over the group like a cold shadow. Frank's face darkened as he processed what Annie was suggesting, that the sabotage had come from someone with inside knowledge of the ranch's operations and equipment. "You're saying it was someone I trust?" he said slowly. "I'm saying it was someone who understands your equipment and your schedule," Annie replied carefully. "Someone who knew when to strike for maximum impact." Isabella crossed her arms, her expression grim. "The child has a point. This wasn't random vandalism. This was targeted and sophisticated." Tyler looked around the barn as if seeing it with new eyes. "How many people have access to this building?" Every employee, plus contractors, delivery drivers, equipment service techs, Frank replied, his voice growing more strained with each category. We're talking about dozens of people over the past few months. Annie walked closer to the workbench where the contaminated filter still sat in its housing. May I look at this more closely? Frank waved impatiently. Go ahead, though I'm not sure what else you can tell us about it. Annie studied the black substance coating the filter element, her nose wrinkling slightly at the acrid smell. This isn't just sand and motor oil like Tyler thought. There's something else mixed in. Something that smells like... She paused, searching for the right words. Like the stuff Daddy uses to clean engine parts. Cole moved to the workbench and leaned closer to the filter. Degreaser? Maybe, Annie said. But if someone mixed degreaser with sand and oil, they'd create something that would not only clog the filter, but also damage seals and gaskets throughout the system. The sophistication of the sabotage was becoming clearer, and with it, the realization that they were dealing with someone who possessed both technical knowledge and a deliberate intent to cause maximum damage to the ranch's operations. This is impersonal, Isabella said quietly. Someone wanted to hurt Frank specifically, not just cause random damage. Frank's jaw worked silently as he processed this information. The idea that someone he knew, someone he trusted enough to give access to his equipment, had deliberately tried to destroy his livelihood was harder to accept than simple mechanical failure. We need to call the sheriff, he said finally. Cole straightened at the mention of law enforcement, his expression shifting to something Annie couldn't quite interpret. Maybe we should fix the bailer first, then worry about who did this. No, Frank replied firmly. If someone on my ranch is sabotaging equipment, I need to know about it now. This could just be the beginning. Annie watched the exchange between her father and the ranch owner, sensing undercurrents that she didn't fully understand, but that felt important. Daddy, are you worried about something? Cole looked down at his daughter, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. I'm worried about a lot of things, sweetheart, but right now I'm mostly worried about getting this equipment fixed and making sure you stay safe. The word safe carried implications that none of them wanted to examine too closely. If the sabotage was personal, if it was targeted specifically at Frank Garrett, then everyone associated with the ranch might be at risk. And if Annie's technical knowledge made her valuable to the investigation, it might also make her a target. Isabella pulled out her phone and began scrolling through contacts. I'll call Karen Reed. She's fair, and she understands agricultural operations better than most law enforcement. Annie looked up at her father with eyes that seemed older than her years. Daddy, does this have something to do with Mama's work? The question hung in the barn air like smoke, and Cole's silence was answer enough for everyone present. Whatever Marie Walker had been involved in before her death, whatever government contracts and security clearances Isabella had mentioned, they were connected to the knowledge that Annie carried, and possibly to the sabotage that threatened to destroy the ranch. Frank Garrett looked from father to daughter, beginning to understand that he'd stepped into something much larger and more complex than a simple equipment failure. Cole, I think it's time you told us exactly what your wife was working on before she died. Cole Walker's hands trembled slightly as he removed his work gloves, a gesture that bought him precious seconds to consider how much truth he was willing to share. The barn had grown oppressive despite its size, the weight of accumulated secrets pressing down on everyone present. Annie stood beside the contaminated filter, her small frame somehow commanding the attention of every adult in the space, waiting for an explanation that her father had spent 3 years avoiding. Marie's work wasn't just agricultural engineering, Cole began slowly, his voice carrying the careful cadence of someone navigating a minefield. She was part of a classified program developing rapid deployment food production systems for military operations. Emergency agriculture, they called it. ways to establish sustainable food sources in hostile or devastated environments. Frank leaned against a support beam, his earlier irritation replaced by a growing comprehension that he'd stumbled into something far beyond ranch politics. "You're talking about feeding armies in war zones. Among other things," Cole confirmed. "The program was broader than that. Disaster relief, refugee situations, anywhere you needed to establish large-scale food production quickly and efficiently. Marie specialized in hydraulic systems for mobile processing equipment, machinery that could be airlifted into remote areas and set up by non-specialists. Annie processed this information with the same methodical attention she'd given to the Bela, though her questions carried an emotional weight that mechanical problems couldn't touch. Is that why she knew so much about bypass circuits and pressure calculations? Your mother could design a complete food processing facility using nothing but standard military hardware and improvised hydraulics," Cole replied, pride and pain mingling in his voice. "She once told me she'd figured out how to turn a Bradley fighting vehicle's hydraulic system into a grain mill." Tyler whistled softly. "That's some serious engineering." "It was," Cole agreed. "But it was also dangerous. Knowledge, the kind of information that could be valuable to people who shouldn't have it." Isabella had been listening with the intensity of someone connecting dots that had been scattered for years. "Cole, how did Marie die?" The question landed like a physical blow, and Annie watched her father's face cycle through expressions of grief, anger, and something that looked like fear. "Officially, car accident on Highway 96 late at night during a thunderstorm. Lost control on a wet curve and hit a tree." "Officially," Frank repeated, catching the emphasis. "What about unofficially?" Cole looked down at Annie, weighing how much a 6-year-old should hear about the circumstances that had shaped her life. Unofficially, there were questions. The accident happened 3 days after Marie told me she'd discovered irregularities in the program. Equipment designs being copied, classified specifications showing up in foreign patents, funding being diverted to unauthorized projects. "She thought someone was stealing the technology," Isabella said. "She thought someone was selling it," Cole corrected. Marie had documentation, evidence of systematic theft of classified agricultural technology. She was planning to present it to her security clearance review board the week after she died. Annie's voice was barely audible when she asked, "Did someone kill Mama?" The silence that followed was answer enough, though Cole couldn't bring himself to say the words directly. The official investigation found no evidence of foul play. The case was closed as an accident. "But you don't believe that," Annie said. "It wasn't a question. I believe your mother was too good a driver to lose control on a road she'd traveled hundreds of times," Cole replied. "I believe she was too careful to drive recklessly in dangerous weather. And I believe that the timing of her death was too convenient for people who had reasons to keep her quiet." Frank pushed himself away from the support beam, his expression grim. "And you think this sabotage might be connected to what happened to your wife?" "I think Annie just demonstrated knowledge that some people would kill to protect," Cole said, bluntly. "Knowledge that died with Marie, or should have." The sound of gravel crunching outside the barn announced the arrival of a vehicle, breaking the heavy atmosphere that had settled over the group. Through the open doors, they could see a white Ford Explorer with the distinctive markings of the Rolling Hills Sheriff's Department pulling into the farmyard. "That'll be Karen," Isabella said, though her voice carried none of the relief that should have accompanied law enforcement's arrival. Sheriff Karen Reed stepped out of her vehicle with the measured movements of someone who'd learned to read situations before fully committing to them. At 45, she carried herself with the confidence of a veteran law enforcement officer, but her military posture and alert eyes suggested a background that extended beyond small-town policing. She wore the standard khaki uniform of the county. "Sheriff's Department, But the way she moved spoke of training that went deeper than civilian law enforcement. "Isabella," she called out as she approached the barn, "you said we had equipment sabotage and some complicated circumstances." "More complicated than we initially thought," Isabella replied, gesturing toward the group gathered around the hay. "Isabella, Karen, you remember Cole Walker and his daughter Annie?" Sheriff Reed's gaze settled on Annie with the kind of attention that made the child feel both protected and scrutinized. "I remember. You're the little girl who helped Doc Webb set that horse's broken leg last spring." Annie nodded shyly. "Yes, ma'am. Buttercup's doing real good now." "I'm sure she is," Karen replied warmly, before her expression grew more serious as she looked at the adults. "Now, what's this about sabotage?" Frank gestured toward the workbench where the contaminated filter still sat in its housing. "Someone deliberately contaminated our hydraulic system with a mixture designed to cause maximum damage. Annie here figured out what happened and how to fix it, but the discovery raised some questions about who might be responsible." Karen approached the filter and examined it without touching, her trained eyes taking in details that civilian observers might miss. "This is sophisticated work, not something a disgruntled employee would do on impulse." She looked up at Frank. "Any recent terminations? Disputes with contractors or suppliers?" "Nothing that would warrant this level of retaliation," Frank replied, "but Cole thinks the sabotage might be connected to something else entirely." Karen turned her attention to Cole, and Annie noticed a subtle shift in the sheriff's demeanor, a sharpening of focus that suggested professional familiarity with complicated situations. "What kind of connection are we talking about, Cole?" Cole glanced at Annie, then at the other men in the barn, clearly struggling with how much to reveal in front of witnesses. "It might be connected to my wife's work before she died. Work that involved classified government programs and people who had reasons to keep certain information from coming to light." Karen's expression grew very still. "Marie Hoffman's work." The use of his wife's maiden name sent a visible shock through Cole. "You knew about Marie's clearance?" "I know about a lot of things that don't generally come up in small-town law enforcement," Karen replied carefully, "including the fact that certain classified programs have left loose ends that occasionally surface in unexpected places." Annie looked between her father and the sheriff, sensing layers of meaning that the adults were navigating with obvious caution. "Sheriff Reed, did you know my mama?" Karen knelt down to Annie's eye level, her voice gentle but serious. "I knew of your mother's work, sweetheart. She was involved in some very important projects that were designed to help people in difficult situations. But someone didn't want her to help people," Annie said, with the clarity that sometimes comes from childish directness. "Some people have reasons for wanting to control information," Karen replied diplomatically, "even information that could do good in the world." Tyler had been listening to this exchange with growing confusion. "Are you saying that what happened to Cole's wife is connected to our equipment being sabotaged?" "I'm saying that Annie just demonstrated technical knowledge that some people would consider valuable," Karen replied, standing up and addressing the group. "Knowledge that was supposed to have died with her mother." Frank's face had gone pale as the implications became clear. "You're telling me that someone sabotaged my equipment to get to a 6-year-old child?" "I'm telling you that the contamination of your hydraulic system required specific technical knowledge and access to your facilities," Karen said. "The same kind of technical knowledge that Annie just used to solve the problem? That's not a coincidence." Isabella crossed her arms, her expression grim. "Someone was testing her." "Or demonstrating her value," Karen replied, "creating a situation where Annie would be forced to reveal what she knows in front of witnesses who could report back to interested parties." Cole moved closer to his daughter, his protective instincts overriding his discomfort with the conversation. "You're saying this was a setup?" "I'm saying that Annie's knowledge makes her unique," Karen said. "And unique individuals sometimes attract unwanted attention from people who see opportunity in other people's talents." Annie looked up at the adults surrounding her, understanding that she had become the center of something larger and more dangerous than a broken hay baler. "Are we in trouble?" Karen's expression softened as she looked down at the child. "You're not in trouble, Annie, but you might be in a situation that requires some careful handling." "What kind of careful handling?" Frank asked. Karen pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts, the kind that involves people with clearances higher than mine and jurisdiction that extends beyond county lines. Cole's face went rigid. "You're calling federal agents?" "I'm calling people who understand what your wife was working on and what it means that Annie has inherited her knowledge," Karen replied. "People who can provide protection if it becomes necessary." "Protection from who?" Tyler asked. Karen looked around the barn, taking in the faces of people who'd stumbled into a situation that none of them had asked for. From anyone who might see a 6-year-old child as either an asset to be acquired or a threat to be eliminated. The weight of those words settled over the group like a physical presence. Annie moved closer to her father, her small hand finding his, while the adults grappled with the realization that their morning had transformed from equipment repair to something that threatened the safety of everyone present. "How long before these federal people arrive?" Frank asked. Karen checked her watch. "If they respond as quickly as I expect, probably 2 hours." 2 hours, Cole repeated. "What do we do until then?" "We finish fixing your baler," Annie said quietly, her voice cutting through the adult conversation with unexpected determination. "Whatever else is happening, the hay still needs to be harvested." Karen smiled at the child's practical focus. "She's right, and staying busy will help pass the time while we wait for backup." Frank looked around the barn one more time, as if seeing it with completely new eyes. "All right then, let's get to work. But from now on, nobody talks about this outside this group, and nobody leaves the ranch alone until we know what we're dealing with." Annie squeezed her father's hand and looked up at him with eyes that seemed to hold more understanding than any child should possess. "Daddy, are the bad people going to try to hurt us?" Cole knelt down and pulled his daughter into a hug that was fierce with protective love. "Not if I can help it, sweetheart. Not if any of us can help it." The next hour passed in a strange combination of focused work and underlying tension, as if everyone in the barn was trying to maintain normalcy while waiting for their world to shift on its axis. Tyler and Clint had driven to Rolling Hills feed, and Supply returning with coils of hydraulic line fittings and a compact auxiliary pump that Annie examined with the critical eye of an engineer reviewing blueprints. Her small hands traced the connections and specifications printed on the equipment labels, occasionally making soft humming sounds that the adults had learned to recognize as her thinking process. Frank paced between the barn and the main house, making phone calls to contractors and suppliers with the sharp efficiency of a man trying to control at least one aspect of an increasingly uncontrollable situation. His voice carried across the farmyard in fragments, rescheduled deliveries, extended deadlines, carefully worded explanations that revealed nothing while buying precious time. Isabella coordinated the work with her characteristic calm competence, but Annie noticed the way the ranch foreman's eyes periodically swept the access roads and how she positioned herself where she could observe both the equipment work and the approaches to the barn. Sheriff Reed had stationed her patrol vehicle where it commanded a clear view of the main road, though she maintained the casual posture of routine law enforcement rather than someone expecting immediate trouble. Cole worked alongside his daughter, following her methodical instructions for routing the bypass hydraulic lines, with a mixture of pride and barely concealed anxiety. Annie's technical knowledge continued to manifest in ways that shouldn't have been possible for someone her age, revealing depths of understanding that made the adults exchange increasingly concerned glances. The pressure regulator needs to be set at 2/3 of the main system rating, Annie explained, her small fingers adjusting components with surprising precision. Too high and you'll blow the seals in the cylinders. Too low and the compression chamber won't develop enough force to properly compact the hay. Tyler paused in his work threading hydraulic line through the baler's framework. Annie, how do you know the specific pressure ratings for this equipment? Annie hesitated, her hands stilling on the regulator adjustment. I'm not sure. Sometimes I just know things. Like when I look at a machine, I can see how it's supposed to work and what might go wrong. That's not normal, sweetheart, Cole said gently, even for someone as smart as you. Mama used to say I had intuitive engineering sense, Annie replied, her voice growing quiet. She said some people are born understanding how systems interact, the same way some people are born understanding music or mathematics. Isabella moved closer, wiping her hands on a shop rag. Your mother was right about that, but intuitive sense still needs training and experience to develop properly. You're demonstrating knowledge that usually takes years of formal education to acquire. Annie looked up at the adults surrounding her, sensing their confusion and concern. Sometimes I dream about machines. Complex ones with lots of moving parts and systems that have to work together perfectly. In the dreams, Mama shows me how everything connects and explains why certain configurations work better than others. The statement hung in the barn air, like a challenge to rational explanation. Dreams didn't typically convey technical engineering knowledge, especially not to 6-year-old children, but the evidence of Annie's capabilities was undeniable, documented in her systematic diagnosis of the sabotage and her practical solution to problems that had stumped experienced mechanics. Sheriff Reed looked up from her position near the barn entrance, where she'd been monitoring radio traffic on her portable unit. Annie, these dreams you have, do they include specific equipment models or just general mechanical principles? Both, Annie replied without hesitation. Sometimes I dream about equipment I've never seen before. Mobile units that can be assembled quickly, systems designed to work in difficult environments, machines that can process different types of crops depending on what's available locally. Cole's face had gone pale. Those sound like descriptions of the prototypes your mother was working on. Emergency agricultural systems, Isabella said quietly. The kind of equipment that could mean the difference between survival and starvation. In disaster zones, Tyler finished securing a hydraulic connection and straightened up, his expression troubled. So you're saying Annie is somehow accessing her mother's technical knowledge through dreams? I'm saying that what we're witnessing isn't entirely explainable through conventional understanding, Sheriff Reed replied carefully. But the important thing right now is that it's real, and it has implications for Annie's safety. The distant sound of approaching vehicles cut through the conversation, causing everyone in the barn to tense. Through the open doors, they could see 2 black SUVs moving down the county road at a speed that suggested official business rather than casual travel. The vehicles turned into the ranch driveway with the purposeful precision of people who knew exactly where they were going. That would be our federal backup, Sheriff Reed said, her hand moving unconsciously to the radio on her belt. Everyone stay calm and let me handle the introductions. The SUVs parked in formation near the barn, their occupants emerging with the coordinated movements of professionals accustomed to working as a team. Annie counted 6 people total, 4 men and 2 women, all dressed in dark suits that marked them as federal agents even before their credentials became visible. The lead agent approached Sheriff Reed with the confident stride of someone accustomed to taking charge of complicated situations. "Sheriff Reed, I'm Special Agent Marcus Webb, Department of Agriculture Office of Inspector General," he announced, extending his hand in greeting. "We appreciate you contacting us about this situation." Annie noticed that despite his title, Agent Webb carried himself with military bearing, and his eyes swept the barn with the tactical awareness of someone trained for more than agricultural investigations. The other agents spread out in a casual but strategic pattern that provided clear sight lines and controlled access to the barn. "Agent Webb," Sheriff Reed replied, shaking his hand, "I have to say your response time was impressive." "The situation involves classified technologies and potentially endangered personnel," Webb replied. "That gets priority attention." His gaze settled on Annie with the focused intensity of someone evaluating a valuable asset. "You must be Annie Grace Walker." Annie moved closer to her father, her natural shyness asserting itself in the face of official scrutiny. "Yes, sir." "Annie, we understand you've been having some interesting conversations about hydraulic systems and engineering principles," Webb continued, his tone carefully neutral. "We'd like to talk with you about what you remember about your mother's work." Cole stepped forward, his protective instincts overriding his intimidation by federal authority. "She's 6 years old. Whatever questions you have can be directed to me." "Actually, Mr. Walker, our questions need to be directed to the person who possesses the technical knowledge we're investigating," Webb replied diplomatically. "But we understand the sensitivity of the situation, and we're prepared to conduct this conversation in a way that's appropriate for Annie's age." One of the other agents, a woman with graying hair and kind eyes, approached the group. "I'm Dr. Sarah Chen, child psychology consultant with the Inspector General's office. I specialize in working with young people who find themselves in complex situations." Annie studied Dr. Chen with the same careful attention she'd given to the Abala, taking in details that would help her assess whether this new adult could be trusted. "Are you here to ask me questions about Mama?" "Among other things," Dr. Chen replied honestly, "but mostly we're here to make sure you're safe and to understand what kind of knowledge you might have inherited from your mother's work." Frank had been observing the federal agents with the wariness of a man unaccustomed to government interference in his business. "What exactly are we dealing with here? And what does it mean for my ranch and my employees?" Agent Webb turned his attention to the ranch owner, his expression growing more serious. "Mr. Garrett, the sabotage of your equipment appears to be connected to a classified program that was compromised several years ago. We believe someone is using your ranch as a testing ground to evaluate Annie's capabilities." "Testing ground? For what?" Isabella asked. "To determine whether she possesses specific technical knowledge that died with her mother," Dr. Chen replied. "Knowledge that certain parties would find extremely valuable." Tyler looked up from the hydraulic system he'd been working on, his face reflecting growing comprehension. "You're saying someone sabotaged our baler specifically to see if Annie could fix it?" "We're saying that the sophistication of the sabotage, combined with the timing and the specific technical challenges it created, suggests deliberate planning, designed to force Annie to demonstrate her abilities," Webb confirmed. "Annie processed this information with the same methodical approach she applied to mechanical problems, though the implications made her stomach feel tight with anxiety. Someone wanted to see if I know what Mama knew." "That's a simplified but accurate assessment," Dr. Chen agreed. The question now is what we do with that information. Clint, who had been quietly listening to the conversation, while continuing to work on the hydraulic bypass, finally spoke up. What kind of people are we talking about? Who would go to these lengths to test a child? Agent Webb exchanged glances with Dr. Chen before answering. People who traffic in classified technologies, industrial espionage networks, foreign intelligence services, private military contractors who specialize in acquiring restricted information, corporate interests that profit from controlled scarcity of agricultural technologies, Dr. Chen added. Organizations that have financial incentives to prevent certain innovations from reaching humanitarian applications. Cole's hands clenched into fists at his sides. You're talking about the same people who killed my wife. We're talking about people who had motives to prevent your wife's discoveries from being implemented, Webb replied carefully. Whether that extended to direct action against Dr. Walker remains under investigation. Annie looked up at her father, seeing the pain and anger that he'd been carrying for 3 years without being able to express it openly. Daddy, are these the bad people who hurt Mama? Cole knelt down and took his daughter's hands in his voice heavy with emotion he could no longer contain. Some of them, sweetheart, and now they might be interested in you because of what Mama taught you. The weight of that knowledge settled over Annie like a burden too heavy for someone so young to carry. But instead of tears or fear, she straightened her small shoulders and looked directly at Agent Webb with eyes that held determination beyond her years. What do you need me to do? She asked simply. Webb studied the child with something approaching admiration. Right now, we need you to help us understand exactly what you know and how you know it. Then we need to make sure you're protected while we figure out who's been watching you and what they're planning to do next. Annie nodded once, the gesture carrying the weight of someone accepting a responsibility she hadn't asked for but couldn't avoid. Okay, but first, can we finish fixing the baler? Mr. Garrett still needs to harvest his hay, and the people who did this shouldn't get to win by destroying his crop. The simplicity and determination of her request seemed to surprise the Federal SAL. Agents who exchanged glances that suggested they weren't accustomed to 6-year-old consultants setting priorities for their investigations. Annie's right, Sheriff Reed said firmly. Whatever else is happening, we can't let the sabotage succeed in its primary objective. Frank needs his equipment functioning, and this community needs its economic stability. Agent Webb considered this for a moment, then nodded slowly. All right, we'll provide security while you complete the repairs, but once that baler is running, we need to have some serious conversations about what happens next. Annie turned back to the hydraulic system, her small hands resuming their careful work on components that would restore life to the massive machine. Around her, adults grappled with conspiracies and federal investigations, but she remained focused on the immediate problem that needed solving. The bypass circuit is almost ready, she announced. We should be able to test it within the hour. And in that moment, surrounded by federal agents and family friends, working to repair equipment sabotaged by unknown enemies, Annie Grace Walker continued to demonstrate that sometimes the most important battles are won, not through confrontation, but through the simple determination to make broken things work again. The hydraulic bypass system hummed to life with a sound that was both foreign and familiar, the clean whir of new components working in harmony with the deeper rumble of the hay baler's mechanical systems awakening after 2 weeks of forced silence. Annie stood beside the control panel, her small finger poised over the test sequence button, while 6 federal agents and a dozen ranch hands watched with the intense attention usually reserved for rocket launches or surgical procedures. Pressure. Holding steady at 2100 psi, Tyler called out, reading from the newly installed gauge that monitored the bypass circuit. Flow rate looks good through the primary compression chamber. Annie nodded and initiated the next test sequence, her movements. Confident despite the weight of federal scrutiny, the massive compression chamber began its cycle, hydraulic cylinders extending and retracting with the precise rhythm that would soon be compacting hay into dense, manageable bales. Each mechanical motion represented hours of careful engineering and improvised problem-solving, but more importantly, it represented the difference between economic survival and devastating loss for everyone who depended on Garrett Ranch. Cycle time is running about 15% slower than optimal, Annie observed, her young voice carrying the technical authority that continued to astonish the adults around her. But that's expected with the reduced pressure rating. It'll still process the hay crop effectively, just not as quickly as the original system. Agent Webb moved closer to observe the control panel, his expression revealing professional appreciation for the elegant simplicity of Annie's solution. How long did it take you to design this bypass configuration? I didn't really design it, Annie replied thoughtfully. I just looked at what was broken and figured out how to make the important parts work again. It's like when you have a blocked artery, you don't fix the blockage right away, you create a bypass so blood can still flow where it needs to go. Dr. Chen made a note in the tablet she'd been using to document the conversation. That's a sophisticated analogy for someone your age. Where did you learn about medical bypass procedures? Annie shrugged with the unconscious gesture that had become familiar to everyone who worked with her. Mama used to say that all systems are basically the same: hydraulic, circulatory, electrical, mechanical. Once you understand how flow and pressure work in one system, you can apply the same principles to others. The simplicity of her explanation belied the advanced engineering concepts it represented, concepts that typically required years of formal education to fully grasp. But Annie's intuitive understanding seemed to bypass traditional learning pathways, accessing knowledge through channels that defied conventional explanation. Frank Garrett emerged from the main house, carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing an expression that mixed relief with lingering anxiety. "How are we looking?" "The bypass is functional," Isabella reported. "We should be able to start cutting hay this afternoon if the weather holds." Frank looked at the federal agents positioned around his barn, their presence a constant reminder that his equipment problems had evolved into something far more complex than mechanical failure. "And our other situation?" Agent Webb checked his watch before answering. "We're expecting additional personnel within the next few hours. Specialists who can provide more comprehensive security assessment and technological evaluation." Annie looked up from the control and panel, her dark eyes reflecting curiosity rather than fear. "What kind of specialists?" Dr. Chen knelt down to Annie's eye level, a gesture that had become her standard approach for important conversations. "People who understand the kind of work your mother was doing. Engineers and security experts who can help us figure out who might be interested in your knowledge and how to keep you safe." "Will they want to take me away from Daddy?" Annie asked, her voice small but direct. The question created a moment of charged silence as the adults grappled with implications they hadn't fully considered. Cole moved to his daughter's side, his protective instincts clearly activated by the possibility of separation. "No one is taking you anywhere without your father's consent," Agent Webb said firmly. "Our job is to protect you and your family, not to disrupt your lives unnecessarily." Annie seemed to accept this assurance, though her next question revealed the depth of her understanding about her situation. "But if the bad people really want what I know, they might try to hurt Daddy or our friends to get to me." The adults exchanged glances that confirmed Annie's assessment was uncomfortably accurate. Individuals or organizations willing to commit sabotage and potentially murder to control agricultural technology wouldn't hesitate to use leverage against a child's family and community. "That's why we're here," Dr. Chen replied honestly, "to make sure that doesn't happen." Clint Morrison had been listening to the conversation while performing final checks on the hydraulic connections, his weathered face reflecting the practical concerns of someone who'd lived through enough challenges to understand when situations were genuinely serious. "What kind of precautions are we talking about? And for how long?" Agent Webb looked around the barn, taking in the faces of people whose lives had been fundamentally altered by circumstances beyond their control. Enhanced security protocols. For the ranch, background checks on anyone with access to the facilities, monitoring of communications and financial transactions that might indicate outside interest in your operations. "Sounds like turning this place into a fortress," Tyler observed. "It sounds like keeping everyone alive," Webb replied bluntly. "The technology Annie has demonstrated knowledge of is worth hundreds of millions of dollars in the right applications. People have killed for much less." Annie walked to the large barn doors and looked out across the wheat fields that stretched toward the horizon, her small figure silhouetted against the Kansas landscape that represented everything familiar and safe in her world. "Agent Webb, if I tell you everything I know, will the bad people leave my friends alone?" The question carried a weight that made every adult in the barn feel the inadequacy of their protection. Here was a 6-year-old child offering to sacrifice her safety for the well-being of her community, displaying a moral courage that put their own concerns into stark perspective. "Annie, it's not that simple," Dr. Chen said gently. "The knowledge you possess doesn't disappear just because you share it with us. In fact, demonstrating what you know might make you more valuable to people who want to exploit that knowledge. But if everyone knows what I know, then I wouldn't be special anymore," Annie reasoned with the logic that sometimes cuts through adult complications like a blade through fog. Agent Webb exchanged a meaningful look with Dr. Chen before responding. "Unfortunately, it's not just what you know that makes you valuable. It's how you know it. Your ability to intuitively understand complex systems, to see solutions that trained engineers miss, to innovate under pressure. Those capabilities can't be simply transferred to other people." Annie absorbed this information with the same methodical attention she'd given to the hydraulic problems, though her shoulders seemed to bear additional weight with each new revelation about her circumstances. "So, I'll always be someone the bad people want. You'll always be someone who needs protection," Cole said, his voice thick with emotion. "But you'll also always be someone who can help solve problems that other people can't solve. That's a gift, even if it comes with complications." The sound of additional vehicles approaching interrupted the conversation, drawing everyone's attention to the ranch entrance, where 2 more government SUVs were turning into the driveway. These vehicles moved with even greater purpose than the first group, and their occupants emerged with the bearing of senior officials accustomed to commanding complex operations. "That would be our technical evaluation team," Agent Webb announced, "and probably some people from higher up the food chain who want to assess this situation personally." Annie watched the new arrivals with the careful attention she gave to all unfamiliar situations, noting details that might be important later. The lead figure was a woman in her 50s, wearing a civilian suit but moving with military precision. She approached the barn with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being the most qualified person in any room she entered. "Agent Webb," she called out while still several yards away. "I'm Deputy Director Amanda Sterling, Agricultural Research Security Division. I understand we have a situation involving classified seed technology and unauthorized knowledge transfer." Webb stepped forward to meet her, his posture reflecting the deference due to superior rank. "Director Sterling, the situation is more complex than the initial reports indicated. We're dealing with a child who appears to have inherited advanced engineering knowledge through means we don't fully understand." Sterling's gaze swept the barn, taking in the modified hay baler, the assembled ranch personnel, and finally settling on Annie with the focused intensity of someone evaluating a strategic asset. This is the Walker child? Annie Grace Walker, age 6, Dr. Chen confirmed, daughter of the late Dr. Marie Hoffman Walker, who held clearances for projects Harvest Moon and Green Valley. The mention of specific project names caused a visible reaction in several of the federal agents, suggesting that Annie's mother had been involved in programs of significant importance and sensitivity. Sterling approached Annie with measured steps, her expression carefully neutral. Annie, I'm Director Sterling. I worked with your mother on some very important projects several years ago. Annie looked up at the director with the same direct gaze she'd used on Agent Webb, taking the measure of another authority figure who claimed connection to her mother's work. Did you like working with Mama? The unexpected question seemed to catch Sterling off guard, and for a moment her official demeanor softened into something more human. Your mother was one of the most brilliant engineers I've ever encountered. She had a gift for seeing solutions that others missed, and she cared deeply about using technology to help people in desperate situations. She taught me that machines should serve people, not the other way around, Annie said quietly. Sterling nodded slowly, as if recognizing familiar philosophy in Annie's words. She was right about that, and from what I'm hearing, she passed that wisdom onto you along with her technical knowledge. Annie gestured toward the modified hay baler, its yellow frame now equipped with the bypass hydraulic system that represented hours of collaborative problem solving. I just tried to make something broken work again. That's what Mama would have done. Sterling examined the bypass system with the expert eye of someone qualified to assess complex engineering solutions. Her inspection was thorough and methodical, taking in details that civilian observers would miss. After several minutes, she straightened up with an expression that mixed professional admiration with deeper concern. This is graduate-level hydraulic engineering, she announced to the assembled group. The pressure calculations, flow management, system integration. This represents knowledge that typically requires years of specialized education to acquire. Cole stepped forward, his voice carrying the strain of 3 years' worth of accumulated worry. Director Sterling, my daughter shouldn't have to carry the burden of knowledge that got her mother killed. Isn't there some way to protect her without turning her into a government asset? Sterling studied Cole with the appraising look of someone weighing multiple competing priorities. Mr. Walker, your daughter possesses capabilities that could revolutionize humanitarian agriculture. The question isn't whether we can ignore that potential, it's whether we can protect it while ensuring it's used for the purposes your wife intended. Annie moved closer to her father, her small hand finding his with the automatic gesture of a child seeking security in an uncertain world. I don't want to revolutionize anything. I just want to help fix things when they're broken. Sometimes, Sterling replied gently. Those are the same thing. The afternoon sun slanted through the barn doors, casting long shadows across the concrete floor where federal agents, ranch hands, and a 6-year-old child grappled with questions that would determine not just Annie's future, but the future of technologies that could feed millions of people in crisis situations around the world. In the distance, the fields of wheat continued their ancient dance in the Kansas wind, oblivious to the human dramas playing out in their shadow. But the hay baler stood ready, its jury-rigged systems prepared to begin the harvest that would ensure the ranch's survival and validate Annie's belief that broken things could always be made to work again if you just understood how to ask the right questions. Director Sterling's examination of the hay baler was interrupted by the sharp buzz of her encrypted phone, a sound that caused every federal agent in the barn to straighten with alert attention. She answered with the clipped efficiency of someone accustomed to crisis communications, her face growing increasingly grim as she listened to whatever intelligence was being relayed. "Understood," she said finally, ending the call and immediately turning to Agent Webb. We have a problem. Surveillance indicates that at least 3 separate parties have been monitoring this ranch for the past 72 hours. 1 vehicle with diplomatic plates, 2 with corporate registrations that trace back to shell companies. The news hit the assembled group like a physical blow. Annie felt her father's hand tighten protectively on her shoulder, while the ranch hands exchanged worried glances that reflected their growing understanding that they'd become unwilling participants in something far beyond their experience. "What kind of monitoring?" Sheriff Reed asked, her hand moving unconsciously toward her service weapon. "Electronic surveillance, telephoto photography, pattern analysis of ranch operations," Sterling replied. "Professional-grade intelligence gathering that suggests multiple interested parties have been tracking Annie's activities and capabilities." Isabella stepped forward, her foreman's instincts focusing on practical concerns. "How long before these people make a move?" "That depends on what they've learned and what they're hoping to achieve," Sterling said. "But the fact that they're operating simultaneously suggests coordination or competition that could force accelerated timelines." Annie looked up at the adults surrounding her, processing the implications with the same systematic approach she applied to mechanical problems. "They've been watching me fix things around the ranch. We have to assume they've been documenting your technical demonstrations, your problem-solving methods, possibly even your conversations about your mother's work," Dr. Chen replied gently. "That's information they could use to assess your value or plan approaches to acquire your cooperation." Cole's jaw tightened with barely controlled anger. "You're talking about kidnapping." "We're talking about multiple scenarios, some of which involve direct acquisition attempts," Sterling confirmed. "Others might involve more subtle approaches, job offers, educational opportunities, research partnerships that appear legitimate, but serve hidden agendas." Tyler had been listening while continuing to monitor the bypass hydraulic system, but now he set down his tools and faced the federal agents directly. "What about the people who work here? Are we targets too?" "Anyone with regular access to Annie could be considered either an asset or a liability," Agent Webb replied honestly. "That includes family, friends, co-workers, and community members who might be used as leverage or sources of information." The weight of that assessment settled over the group like smoke from an unwanted fire. These were people whose greatest previous concern had been weather patterns and commodity prices, now grappling with the possibility that their association with a 6-year-old child had made them targets for international espionage and potential violence. Frank Garrett had been standing silently near the barn entrance, watching the county road for signs of unusual activity. "Director Sterling, what kind of protection can you provide for my employees and their families?" "Enhanced security presence, communication monitoring, background verification of anyone seeking access to ranch operations," Sterling replied. "But I need to be honest. Comprehensive protection for an entire community requires resources and coordination that may take time to implement fully." Annie walked to the control panel of the modified hay baler and ran her small fingers along the switches and gauges that represented hours of collaborative problem-solving. "What if I went away with you? Would that make everyone else safe?" The question created a moment of profound silence as every adult in the barn confronted the possibility that a child might sacrifice her freedom to protect the people she cared about. Cole immediately moved to his daughter's side, his voice thick with emotion. "Annie, you're not going anywhere without me. We're a family, and families stick together." "But if staying here puts everyone in danger," Annie began. "Then we figure out how to eliminate the danger," Cole interrupted firmly. "We don't run away from problems, and we don't let other people's threats break up our family." Director Sterling watched this exchange with the calculating expression of someone weighing multiple strategic options. "Mr. Walker, your protective instincts are admirable, But the reality is that Annie's knowledge makes her a permanent target. Moving locations might provide temporary security, but it doesn't address the underlying problem. Which is, Isabella asked. That there are people who will never stop trying to acquire or control what Annie knows, Sterling replied. People who see her capabilities as worth any risk, any expenditure, any level of violence necessary to secure them. Annie looked around, at the faces of the adults who'd become her extended family through years of ranch life. Tyler with his patient willingness to explain mechanical concepts, Clint with his gentle protectiveness, Isabella with her steady guidance, Frank with his gruff but genuine care for his employees' welfare. The thought that her presence endangered them was almost unbearable. There has to be another way, she said quietly. Dr. Chen knelt beside Annie, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who genuinely cared about the child's well-being rather than just her strategic value. What if there was a way to protect both? You and your community while still allowing you to use your gifts to help people? What kind of way? Annie asked. A controlled environment where you could continue learning and developing your capabilities, but with security measures that keep everyone safe, Dr. Chen explained. Think of it as a special school where you could work on projects that help people while being protected from those who might want to misuse your knowledge. Cole's expression darkened. You're talking about institutionalizing my daughter. I'm talking about providing her with resources and protection that match her unique needs and circumstances, Dr. Chen replied diplomatically. Resources that no single family or community can provide on their own. Annie considered this proposal. With the same methodical analysis she applied to engineering problems, weighing variables and calculating outcomes with disturbing maturity for someone her age. Would I be able to come home to visit Daddy and my friends? Arrangements could be made for regular contact and visits, Sterling said carefully. But the primary focus would need to be on maintaining security and advancing your education in ways that serve broader humanitarian purposes. The conversation was interrupted by the sharp crack of Sheriff Reed's radio crackling to life with urgent communications. She moved away from the group to respond, her voice low, but carrying enough urgency to draw concerned glances from everyone in the barn. We have movement on County Road 47, she announced after ending the radio conversation. 3 vehicles approaching from different directions, coordinated timing, no obvious legitimate business in this area. Agent Webb immediately activated his own communication device, issuing rapid instructions to personnel positioned around the ranch perimeter. All units implement Security Protocol Alpha. No one enters or leaves the ranch without clearance. Annie watched the federal agents transition into tactical mode with the fascination of someone observing a complex system shift into emergency operation. Despite the danger, she found herself analyzing their coordination and communication methods with the same systematic attention she'd given to the hydraulic problems. Are those the bad people coming to get me? She asked with remarkable calmness. We don't know yet, Sterling replied honestly, but we're not taking any chances. Cole moved to his daughter and knelt down to her eye level, his hands gently gripping her shoulders. Annie, I need you to listen very carefully. If I tell you to do something, you do it immediately without asking questions. If Dr. Chen or Agent Webb tells you to do something and I'm not around to ask, you do what they say. Can you promise me that? Annie nodded solemnly, understanding that her father was preparing for possibilities that neither of them wanted to. Consider, I promise, Daddy. The sound of approaching engines grew louder, causing Tyler and Clint to move instinctively toward the barn's rear exit, while Isabella positioned herself where she could observe both the main approach and potential escape routes. Frank had retrieved a shotgun from the ranch office, holding it with the competence of someone raised in rural Kansas, but hoping never to need it. Contact in 30 seconds. Agent Webb announced, receiving updates through his earpiece. 3 vehicles, tinted windows, stopping just outside visual range of the ranch entrance. Annie felt the familiar tightness in her stomach that came when systems were operating outside their normal parameters, when variables couldn't be controlled and outcomes couldn't be predicted with engineering precision. But alongside the anxiety was something else, a determination that whatever happened, she wouldn't let fear prevent her from protecting the people she loved. "Agent Webb," she said quietly, "if these people want to talk to me, maybe I should talk to them." "Absolutely not," Cole said immediately. "But if they just want to know what I know, maybe I can convince them that I'm not worth the trouble they're causing," Annie reasoned. "Maybe I can make them understand that hurting innocent people won't get them what they want." Sterling looked at the child with something approaching admiration mixed with deep concern. "Annie, these aren't people who respond to reason or moral arguments. They're people who see you as a commodity to be acquired and exploited. Then, maybe it's time they learned that commodities can fight back," Annie replied, with a quiet fierceness that reminded everyone present that she was Marie Walker's daughter, a woman who died rather than allow her knowledge to be misused. The vehicles outside had stopped, their occupants apparently conducting surveillance or preparation for whatever action they intended to take. Inside the barn, federal agents, ranch hands, and a 6-year-old child prepared for a confrontation that would determine not just Annie's immediate future, but the fate of technology that could transform agricultural relief efforts worldwide. Through the barn doors, the Kansas landscape remained unchanged. Endless fields of grain dancing in the wind, cattle grazing peacefully in distant pastures, the eternal rhythm of rural life continuing regardless of human dramas. But the people sheltering in the equipment barn understood that everything familiar and safe was about to be tested by forces that recognized no boundaries between innocence and strategic value. Annie moved closer to the modified hay baler, and resting on the control panel that represented her first major engineering triumph. Whatever happened next, she'd proven that broken systems could be repaired, that impossible problems could be solved, and that sometimes the smallest person in the room possessed the most important answers. Now she would have to prove that courage. Like engineering knowledge could be inherited and applied when circumstances demanded solutions that no textbook had ever taught. The first vehicle emerged from behind a grove of cottonwoods along County Road 47, moving with the deliberate pace of someone conducting final reconnaissance before committing to action. Through binoculars retrieved from the ranch office, Agent Webb observed a black sedan with government plates, its occupants visible as shadows behind tinted glass that suggested official business conducted in unofficial circumstances. "State Department. Vehicle," he announced quietly. "But that doesn't mean State Department personnel." Director Sterling moved to a position where she could observe the approaching vehicles while maintaining cover behind the barn's structural supports. "Diplomatic plates are easy to forge or acquire through corrupt channels. We can't assume legitimate government interest." The second vehicle appeared moments later from the opposite direction, a white SUV with corporate markings that identified it as belonging to Meridian Agricultural Solutions, a name that meant nothing to the ranch personnel, but caused visible reactions among the federal agents. "Meridian is a front company for Blackwater Agricultural," Dr. Chen said grimly. "Private military contractors who specialize in securing agricultural technologies for clients who prefer to remain anonymous." Annie processed this information while keeping her attention focused on the hay baler's control panel, finding comfort in the familiar complexity of mechanical systems that behaved according to predictable principles. Unlike the human behavior unfolding around her, hydraulic circuits didn't lie, manipulate, or pursue hidden agendas. "What's Blackwater Agricultural's interest in emergency farming equipment?" Isabella asked. "They broker classified technologies to foreign governments and corporate clients," Sterling replied. Countries that want to control food production in regions they're destabilizing. Corporations that profit from artificial scarcity in humanitarian markets. The implications hit the ranch personnel like cold water. These weren't academic researchers or legitimate agricultural companies seeking to advance humanitarian technology. These were people who weaponized hunger, who saw Annie's knowledge as a tool for controlling populations through controlled access to life-sustaining resources. Cole's hands clenched into fists as he fully grasped what his daughter represented to such organizations. They want to use her knowledge to starve people. They want to use her knowledge to control who gets fed and who doesn't, Sterling corrected. Which amounts to the same thing, but with profit margins and political leverage built into the system. The third vehicle materialized from a farm road that shouldn't have provided access to anyone unfamiliar with local geography, suggesting advanced surveillance and route planning that spoke of professional preparation. This one bore no identifying marks, its occupants invisible behind windows that reflected the afternoon sun like mirrors. Unknown actors, Agent Webb reported. Could be additional corporate interests, foreign intelligence, or independent contractors, working for undisclosed clients. Annie watched the federal agents coordinate their response with the efficiency of people trained for exactly this type of situation, but she noticed something that the adults seemed to miss. Agent Webb, why are they all stopping just outside rifle range? Webb looked at the child with surprise, not expecting 6-year-olds to understand tactical positioning. What makes you think that's significant? Because if they wanted to hurt us, they'd get closer for better accuracy, Annie replied matter-of-factly. If they wanted to run away, they'd stay farther back for easier escape. But they're positioned exactly where they can observe everything we do while staying safe from immediate retaliation. Sterling studied Annie with growing comprehension that the child's analytical capabilities extended far beyond mechanical engineering. You're suggesting they're here to negotiate rather than attack. I'm suggesting they're here to evaluate, Annie corrected. They want to see how we respond to pressure. What kind of protection I have, whether I'm worth the risk of direct confrontation. The adult conversation was interrupted by the buzz of Sterling's encrypted phone, this time displaying a number that made her expression shift from concern to something approaching alarm. She answered with the cautious tone of someone expecting bad news. Director Sterling, yes, I understand. How certain is that intelligence? I see, thank you. She ended the call and immediately turned to address the group with the urgency of someone whose timeline had just been dramatically compressed. We have a problem. Intelligence indicates that one of the vehicles contains Dr. Marcus Kellerman, former Defense Department contractor who worked with your wife on Project Harvest Moon. Cole's face went white at the mention of his wife's colleague. Marcus is here? But he was Marie's friend. He helped design some of the mobile processing systems she was working on. Dr. Kellerman disappeared 6 months after your wife's death, Sterling replied grimly. We've been tracking him through shell companies and offshore accounts that suggest he's been selling classified agricultural technologies to the highest bidders. The betrayal hit Cole like a physical blow. Marcus Kellerman had attended Marie's funeral, had offered his condolences, had spoken movingly about her dedication to humanitarian engineering. The possibility that he'd been involved in her death, or had profited from it, was almost incomprehensible. He knows what Mama was working on, Annie said quietly, her young voice carrying the weight of someone processing information that changed everything she thought she knew about her mother's death. He knows what your mother discovered about the technology theft, and he knows that you might have inherited knowledge that could expose his activities, Dr. Chen confirmed gently. Annie walked to the barn's main doors and looked out across the farmyard toward the vehicles positioned along the perimeter roads. Somewhere in those cars sat a man who'd betrayed her mother's trust, who'd possibly contributed to her death, and who now saw Annie as either an asset to be acquired or a threat to be eliminated. "I want to talk to him," she announced. "Absolutely not," Cole said immediately, moving to block her path toward the doors. "Daddy, he knew Mama. He worked with her. If I can convince him that I don't know anything dangerous, maybe he'll leave. Us alone." Sterling shook her head firmly. "Annie, Dr. Kellerman isn't here to be convinced of anything. He's here to assess your capabilities and determine how to exploit them for maximum profit. Then maybe it's time he learned that some things can't be exploited," Annie replied, with a determination that reminded everyone present of her mother's legendary stubbornness. Agent Webb's radio crackled to life with updates from the perimeter. "Security teams. Director, we have movement from the unmarked vehicle. Single individual approaching on foot, hands visible, carrying what appears to be a briefcase." Through the barn doors, they could see a figure walking across the farmyard with the confident stride of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted through negotiation rather than force. Even at a distance, Cole recognized the familiar gait and bearing of Dr. Marcus Kellerman, the man who'd once been welcomed at family dinners and had bounced baby Annie on his knee while discussing hydraulic engineering with her mother. "He's coming to make an offer," Sterling said grimly. "Something he thinks will be attractive enough to gain cooperation without force." Annie studied the approaching figure with the same systematic attention she'd given to the hay baler's problems, analyzing body language and movement patterns for clues about intentions and capabilities. "He's scared," she observed. "His shoulders are too tight, and he's walking like someone who's not sure he can control what happens next." "Fear makes people desperate," Dr. Chen warned, "and desperate people make dangerous decisions." Cole retrieved his own rifle from the rack near the barn office, checking the action with the automatic motions of someone whose military training had never quite faded. "If he thinks he can walk onto my property and threaten my daughter, he's about to learn otherwise. Let me handle the initial contact," Sterling requested. "We need to understand what he's offering before we determine how to respond." Dr. Kellerman stopped approximately 50 yards from the barn, close enough for conversation, but far enough to maintain tactical advantage for either side. He was a tall man in his 50s, wearing an expensive suit that looked out of place in the rural Kansas setting. His briefcase and formal attire suggested corporate negotiation rather than academic research. "Cole Walker," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the farmyard. "I know you're in there. I think it's time we had a conversation about Annie's future." Cole stepped into the doorway, his rifle held in a casual but ready position. "Marcus, you've got some nerve showing up here after what you've done." "What I've done is preserve your wife's work and ensure it reaches people who can implement it effectively," Kellerman replied, with the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to justifying morally questionable decisions. "Marie's designs are being used to feed millions of people in crisis situations around the world. Marie's designs are being used to control who gets fed and who starves," Sterling interjected, moving into view beside Cole. "We know about the shell companies, Marcus. We know about the offshore accounts and the clients who pay premium prices for artificial scarcity." Kellerman's expression shifted as he recognized Sterling, suggesting that her presence complicated whatever approach he'd planned. "Director Sterling, I should have expected Defense Department involvement once Annie's capabilities became apparent." Annie moved to the doorway, positioning herself where Kellerman could see her while remaining under the protection of her father and the federal agents. "Dr. Kellerman, why did you hurt my mama?" The directness of the question seemed to catch Kellerman off guard, his prepared negotiating stance faltering in the face of a child's moral clarity. "Annie, I never wanted to hurt your mother. Marie was brilliant, dedicated, passionate about using technology to help people. But she was also naive about how the world really works. She knew the difference between helping people and exploiting them. Annie replied with quiet firmness. That's not naive. That's called having principles. Kellerman opened his briefcase and withdrew a tablet computer, holding it where Annie could see the screen. I want to show you something, Annie. I want you to see what your mother's work has accomplished in the hands of people who understand. Practical implementation. The screen displayed images of mobile agricultural facilities in operation, complex machinery processing grain in refugee camps, hydraulic systems providing water purification in disaster zones, rapid deployment food, production systems serving populations in crisis situations around the world. These are real applications of your mother's designs, Kellerman continued. Real people being fed, real problems being solved. This is the legacy Marie left behind. Annie studied the images with the analytical eye she applied to all complex systems, noting details that revealed more than Kellerman intended. Those aren't humanitarian operations, she said quietly. Those are corporate installations with armed security and restricted access. Sterling looked at the child with growing amazement at her ability to read tactical situations with the same precision she applied to mechanical problems. What do you see that tells you that? The fencing patterns around the facilities are designed to keep people out, not to protect people inside, Annie explained. The security posts are positioned to control access rather than provide safety. And the processing equipment is configured for maximum efficiency rather than maximum access. They're designed to process large quantities quickly for controlled distribution, not to provide immediate relief to populations in crisis. Kellerman's facade of humanitarian concern began to crack as he realized that Annie's analytical capabilities extended far beyond mechanical engineering. You're too young to understand the complexities of international aid distribution. I'm old enough to understand the difference between helping people and controlling them, Annie replied. And I'm old enough to know that Mama would never have approved of using her work to hurt people. The conversation was interrupted by Agent Webb's urgent voice through his radio communication. Director, we have additional movement from all three vehicles, multiple individuals deploying, tactical formation, weapons visible. The negotiation phase was ending. Whatever Kellerman had hoped to accomplish through conversation, he was apparently prepared to pursue through other means. Inside the barn, federal agents and ranch personnel prepared for a confrontation that would determine not just Annie's fate, but the future of humanitarian technology that could transform disaster relief efforts worldwide. Annie looked out at the figures moving into position around the ranch buildings, understanding that the next few minutes would test everything she'd learned about courage, loyalty, and the determination to protect what mattered most. Somewhere in her inherited memories of her mother's work was knowledge that could save lives or destroy them, depending on whose hands controlled its application. The time for hiding behind adult protection had ended. The time for Annie Grace Walker to prove that wisdom, like mechanical aptitude, could be inherited and applied when circumstances demanded solutions that no one else could provide. The tactical situation deteriorated rapidly as armed figures emerged from all three vehicles, moving with the coordinated precision of professionals executing a carefully rehearsed plan. Agent Webb's radio chattered with urgent updates from federal personnel positioned around the ranch perimeter, their reports painting a picture of overwhelming force converging on the barn from multiple directions. 12 hostiles confirmed. Military-grade equipment, establishing crossfire positions, came the terse communication. Request immediate backup and rules of engagement clarification. Director Sterling assessed the tactical reality with the cold efficiency of someone trained to calculate odds and outcomes under pressure. The Federal agents were outnumbered and outgunned, positioned defensively in a structure that offered limited escape routes. More importantly, any prolonged firefight would endanger not only Annie, but the civilian ranch personnel who'd been caught in circumstances beyond their understanding or control. "Webb, what's our response time for additional support?" she asked. "Quietly, minimum 40 minutes for tactical teams, assuming they can navigate county roads without local knowledge," Webb replied. "We're on our own until then." Annie watched the adult conversation with the systematic attention that had become her trademark, processing information and calculating variables with the same methodical approach she'd used to solve the hydraulic problems. But unlike mechanical systems, human conflicts involved emotional and psychological factors that couldn't be resolved through engineering principles alone. "Dr. Kellerman," she called out, stepping closer to the barn doorway despite her father's restraining hand on her shoulder. "You said you wanted to show me what Mama's work accomplished. I want to see all of it." Kellerman paused in his coordination with the armed personnel, clearly not expecting continued negotiation as tactical deployment proceeded around them. "Annie, this isn't the time for extended technical discussions." "This is exactly the time," Annie replied with a calmness that seemed almost unnatural given the circumstances, "because once the shooting starts, nobody will be able to talk anymore, and you'll never get what you really came for." Sterling looked at the child with growing comprehension of what Annie was attempting. By maintaining dialogue, she was buying time for federal reinforcements while potentially creating opportunities to diffuse the situation before it escalated to violence that could endanger everyone present. "What is it you think I came for?" Kellerman asked, his attention divided between Annie and the tactical communications he was receiving through an earpiece. "You came for proof that I actually know what Mama knew," Annie said simply, "because if I don't, then killing people to get to me is just murder without profit. And if I do, then you need me alive and cooperative to access that knowledge effectively." The brutal logic of her assessment seemed to give Kellerman pause, forcing him to confront the practical implications of his chosen course of action. Around the ranch buildings, armed personnel held their positions but refrained from advancing, apparently awaiting orders that hadn't yet been issued. Cole moved closer to his daughter, his voice low but urgent. "Annie, what are you doing?" "I'm buying time," she replied quietly, "and I'm trying to find a solution that doesn't get anyone killed." Dr. Chen knelt beside Annie, her professional training in child psychology helping her understand the remarkable courage and analytical thinking that the situation was demanding from someone so young. "What kind of solution are you considering?" Annie looked around the barn at the faces of people who'd become her extended family through years of shared work and mutual respect. Tyler and Clint, Isabella and Frank, Sheriff Reed and the federal agents, all of them were at risk because of knowledge she'd inherited and circumstances she'd never chosen. "Dr. Kellerman wants to know what I can do," she said thoughtfully. "Maybe I should show him." "Show him what?" Sterling asked. Annie walked to the modified hay baler and placed her small hands on the control panel that represented hours of collaborative engineering and problem solving. "Show him that some things are more valuable when they're freely given than when they're stolen." She activated the hydraulic system, and the massive machine came to life with the steady rhythm that had proven her technical capabilities just hours earlier. But this time, instead of simply demonstrating functionality, Annie began making subtle adjustments to the bypass circuit. Modifications that weren't immediately apparent to casual observation, but represented fundamental changes to the system's operational parameters. "What are you doing to the machine?" Frank asked, recognizing that Annie was implementing alterations beyond the original repair work. "I'm creating a teaching demonstration," Annie replied, her fingers moving across controls and connections with practice confidence. Something that will show Dr. Kellerman exactly what kind of knowledge I possess, while also ensuring that knowledge can't be misused. Sterling watched Annie's work with growing understanding of the child's strategy. You're building in safeguards, I'm T. Building in choices, Annie corrected. The system will work perfectly for legitimate humanitarian applications, processing food for refugee populations, providing emergency agricultural support in disaster zones, serving communities that need immediate assistance. But if someone tries to use it for population control or artificial scarcity, the safeguards will prevent effective operation. Kellerman had moved closer to observe Annie's modifications, his expression shifting from tactical coordination to professional fascination as he began to comprehend the sophistication of what she was implementing. That's not possible. You can't engineer moral choices into mechanical systems. You can, if you understand the difference between efficiency and effectiveness, Annie replied without looking up from her work. Mama taught me that the best engineering solutions are the ones that serve human needs rather than human greed. The armed personnel positioned around the ranch buildings maintained their tactical positions, but the immediate tension had shifted as their employer became absorbed in technical evaluation rather than extraction planning. Annie's demonstration had transformed the confrontation from a military operation into something resembling a graduate-level engineering examination. Dr. Kellerman, she continued, implementing additional modifications to the hydraulic control system. If you really want to honor Mama's work, then you need to understand what she was actually trying to accomplish. Your mother was trying to develop rapid deployment agricultural technology for emergency situations, Kellerman replied, though his voice carried less certainty than before. Mama was trying to build systems that couldn't be weaponized, Annie corrected. Technology that would automatically serve humanitarian purposes, regardless of who operated it. She knew that good intentions weren't enough. She had to engineer goodness into the machines themselves. Sterling exchanged glances with Agent Webb, both recognizing that Annie was revealing capabilities and knowledge that extended far beyond what anyone had anticipated. The child wasn't just demonstrating inherited technical skills, she was showing practical application of ethical engineering principles that represented revolutionary advances in humanitarian technology design. The modifications you're implementing, Dr. Chen said slowly, they're based on your mother's classified research. They're based on principles Mama taught me about making machines that serve people instead of controlling them, Annie replied. Every system has multiple possible configurations. The choice of which configuration to implement determines whether the technology helps people or hurts them. Annie completed her modifications and stepped back from the control panel, her small frame dwarfed by the massive agricultural machinery that now represented something far more significant than a simple hay baler. Dr. Kellerman, would you like to see how this works? Kellerman approached the machine with obvious internal conflict, torn between professional curiosity and awareness that he was being offered something that could fundamentally change his understanding of what Marie Walker had actually achieved in her classified research. If you activate this system, he said carefully, will it demonstrate the full scope of your mother's innovations? It will demonstrate the choice every engineer has to make, Annie replied, whether to build systems that empower people or systems that control them. The sound of distant helicopters interrupted the conversation, growing louder as federal reinforcements approached the ranch from multiple directions. Agent Webb confirmed the incoming support through his radio communications, while the armed personnel around the buildings began showing signs of tactical uncertainty as their operational timeline compressed. Dr. Kellerman, Sterling called out, you have approximately 10 minutes before this location is secured by federal tactical teams. I suggest you use that time to consider whether you want to be arrested as a terrorist or credited as someone who helped resolve this situation peacefully." Kellerman looked around at the converging forces, the ranch personnel caught in circumstances beyond their control, and the 6-year-old child who demonstrated capabilities that challenged everything. He thought he understood about engineering ethics and practical implementation. "Annie," he said finally, "if I walk away from this, if I call off my people and leave you alone, what guarantee do I have that you won't use what you know to expose my previous activities?" Annie met his gaze with the direct honesty that had characterized all her interactions throughout the crisis. "I don't want to hurt anyone, Dr. Kellerman. I just want to fix things that are broken and help people who need help. If you stop trying to hurt my family and friends, then we don't have a problem." The simplicity of her offer seemed to surprise Kellerman, who'd apparently expected complex negotiations involving immunity agreements and financial considerations. Instead, he was being offered forgiveness in exchange for nothing more than walking away from a child and her community. "And if others come looking for you, if other organizations decide you're too valuable to leave alone, then I'll deal with those problems when they happen," Annie replied with quiet confidence. "The same way I dealt with the hay baler and the same way I'm dealing with this situation. I'll figure out what's broken and find a way to fix it." The helicopters were closer now, their rotor noise indicating that federal reinforcements would arrive within minutes. Kellerman made a series of rapid hand signals to his personnel, who began withdrawing to their vehicles with the disciplined efficiency of professionals executing a planned extraction. "This isn't over, Annie," he said, though his tone carried more resignation than threat. "Others will come, others who won't be as reasonable as I've been." "Maybe," Annie acknowledged, "but every system has weaknesses that can be exploited by people who understand how it really works. And I'm very good at understanding how things work." As the 3 vehicles departed and federal helicopters settled onto the ranch property, Annie walked back to the hay baler and shut down the modified hydraulic system. The immediate crisis had passed, but the larger questions about her future, her knowledge, and her role in protecting humanitarian technology from exploitation remained unresolved. Cole wrapped his arms around his daughter, holding her with the fierce protectiveness of someone who'd come closer to losing everything than he ever wanted to experience again. "Annie, are you okay?" "I'm okay, Daddy," she replied, though her voice carried the weariness of someone who'd been forced to grow up faster than anyone should have to. "But I think our lives are going to be different now." Director Sterling approached them as federal tactical teams secured the ranch perimeter and began processing the scene. "Annie, the modifications you made to the baler, can you document those techniques for our research teams?" Annie looked up at the director with eyes that seemed older than her years. "I can teach people how to build systems that can't be misused. But first, I want to make sure Mr. Garrett gets his hay harvest completed. Some things are more important than government research." Frank Garrett, who'd watched the entire confrontation with the bewildered amazement of someone whose simple equipment problem had evolved into international conspiracy, managed a tired smile. "Annie, that baler has never run better. I think we can get the harvest done just fine." As the sun set over the Kansas wheat fields, painting the landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Annie Grace Walker stood in the doorway of the equipment barn and looked out across the farmland that represented everything familiar and safe in her world. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions about her capabilities and her future. But tonight, the hay baler was running, the crop would be saved, and the people she loved were safe. Sometimes in a world complicated by greed and politics, and the weaponization of knowledge. The most important victories were also the simplest, fixing what was broken, protecting what mattered, and proving that wisdom and courage could be inherited by anyone brave enough to use them when circumstances demanded nothing less than the best of human nature applied to impossible problems. The harvest could begin at dawn, and Annie would be there to make sure the machines worked properly, because that's what Walker women did. They fixed things that were broken and made sure the work got done, regardless of who was watching or what they wanted to take away. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss this. Just click to watch, and don't forget to subscribe. It would mean a lot.